Welcome to Swai Files. I am Swai. We had been searching the entire forest all day, and the darkness was slowly swallowing everything around us. Laura was panting, her frantic eyes darting across the dense rows of trees, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out from the endless shadows. Her face clearly showed anxiety, her trembling hands gripping the flashlight, but its dim light no longer brought any sense of safety. There was no sign of Janine, and I began to wonder if she was even still alive. But what was more terrifying was, something else might be lurking in this forest. Darkness covered every corner, the stillness eerie. A chill crawled up my spine, each step feeling like it was treading on invisible terror. I said nothing, but my eyes kept scanning, fully aware that something was watching us. Something wasn't right, very wrong. The wind hissed through the leaves, or was it the forest breathing? No, this was unnatural. A faint sound suddenly pierced the thick atmosphere, a voice. A call from within the darkness. Faint, like someone whispering from afar, carried by the wind, yet clear enough to make me shiver. I froze, my body stiff like stone, my ears strained to listen, while my eyes tried to penetrate the thick blackness ahead. The feeling of being watched from the forest grew stronger. It wasn't just an inanimate darkness, it was something alive. Something malevolent. "Damn it," I muttered. My heart was pounding in my chest. I sensed Laura's hesitation, her heavy breathing behind me, each breath echoing in the terrifyingly quiet air. But there was no time for fear. If Janine was still alive, she might be just behind this thick veil of darkness. Or maybe something worse was waiting. I tightened my grip on the gun, my finger trembling on the trigger. The wind grew stronger, howling through the ancient trees, carrying something with it. Something invisible but heavy, and the whispering came again, clearer this time. It wasn't a call for help. It was more like an invitation, a haunting sound luring us deeper. I glanced at Laura. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but we had no choice. Whether it was Janine or something else, we had to move forward. Walking through the terror, there was no turning back. The forest ahead seemed to swallow us in its deep darkness, while behind us, the whispers grew louder, closer. Darkness was flooding the Oregon forest, where the dense canopy blocked out the sky. Below, the space seemed eerily silent. Laura, my partner in the search and rescue team, and I had just finished a long day searching for Janine Wallace, a woman who had gone missing in this area. She had been missing for 2 days, and the silence of the forest only deepened the worry in my chest. The base had contacted us, requesting that we return in the morning, but I had a feeling something wasn't right. I couldn't leave this forest knowing that Janine might still be out there, trapped or worse. We set up camp near a small stream, lit a fire, and began taking turns keeping watch. The night in the forest seemed longer than usual, with darkness engulfing everything. Every sound, no matter how small, leaves falling, branches snapping, startled me. Around midnight, I heard a strange sound. It was a whisper, faint and rhythmic, like some murmur carried by the wind. I tried to pinpoint the source, but whenever I thought I had found it, it disappeared, as if it was moving all around us. "Do you hear that?" I whispered to Laura. She nodded, her face pale. "Yes, but what is it?" Both of us stopped, straining to listen. The sound grew clearer, no longer just a whisper, but a low, rough voice speaking in a language I couldn't understand. It came from every direction, as if the forest itself was speaking to us. A chill ran down my spine when I realized we were no longer alone. Without speaking, we made a decision together. We had to find the source of that voice. Laura and I followed the beam of our flashlights, stepping deeper into the forest. The darkness seemed thicker, the light from the flashlights swaying helplessly as if fighting against some invisible force. The voice led us to a cave hidden behind some bushes. The entrance was so ordinary that we might have missed it if we hadn't been searching carefully. Laura and I exchanged looks, a heavy sense of dread pressing down on both of us. But there was no turning back. We had to go in. The air inside the cave was cold and damp. The walls were slick with moisture, and every step we took echoed in the enclosed space. The voice grew louder, more threatening, as if inviting us deeper. And then we saw it, a sight I would never forget. In the main chamber of the cave, illuminated by a strange light, we found Janine. She was alive, but barely. She was tied to a crude altar in the center of the room, her eyes wide open, filled with terror. Her body was covered in cuts and bruises. Standing over her was a creature I couldn't describe in words. It had a human shape, but twisted in ways that defied nature, like some dark joke of creation. The creature turned toward us, its empty eyes boring into my soul. It spoke in that strange language we had heard before, its voice freezing the blood in my veins. Without hesitation, Laura was the first to react. She raised her gun and fired. The gunshot echoed through the narrow cave, and the creature let out a scream, a soul-piercing shriek filled with hatred. It lunged toward us, but I quickly cut Janine's bindings, and we started to run. The creature's screams chased us as we fled through the dark tunnels. When we finally burst out of the cave, the fresh night air outside filled my lungs. Laura was limping, clutching her side where the creature had struck her. But we didn't stop. We ran until we reached the camp, collapsing on the ground, our bodies still trembling from the adrenaline. The sun had started to rise, its pale light filtering through the thick trees, but none of us felt safe. Laura, Janine, and I sat around the dying fire, our bodies exhausted, our minds stretched to the breaking point. Silence surrounded us, but in my mind, the creature's scream from the cave still echoed, like a nightmare that would never end. Janine was still in a state of panic. Though we had escaped the creature, she could only mutter a few broken sentences, as if her mind was still trapped in the darkness of the cave. Laura sat beside her, her trembling hands trying to hold Janine's, but it seemed there was no way to bring her back to reality. "We need to get her out of here," I said, my voice low. "The longer we stay in this forest, the more danger we're in." Laura nodded, her eyes filled with agreement, but also fear. "That thing, it's still out there, isn't it?" she asked, her voice trembling, as if just mentioning it would drag us back into the nightmare. I couldn't deny it. "I don't know what it is, but one thing's for sure. We need to get out of here before it comes back." We packed up quickly, leaving no trace behind, as if trying to erase every memory of the terrifying night. Janine said nothing more, but her eyes kept glancing toward the forest, as if she sensed something was watching us. As we began our journey back to the base, a growing unease settled over me. It wasn't just the creature in the cave that worried me, but the feeling that it was no longer there, as if it had escaped and was now free in the forest. Our footsteps pressed lightly on the damp ground, but the silence surrounding us was strangely frightening. There were no sounds of birds or animals moving through the underbrush, only a dead silence that made everything feel heavier. The distance to the base wasn't far, but each step felt like it stretched on forever. Sometimes I thought I saw something move in the shadows of the trees, but every time I turned around, I only saw the tall, cold, lifeless trunks. "Listen." Laura suddenly stopped, gripping my arm. She tilted her head, her eyes wide. This time, I heard it too. A rhythmic pounding, a low growl, exactly like the sound we had heard the previous night. It wasn't far off, seemingly getting closer, but not in a straight line. It circled us, like it was playing a game of cat and mouse. "Hurry," I whispered, urging the group to move faster. There was no time to think, only the instinct to survive drove us. The pounding echoed through the forest, no longer whispers but vivid, horrifying sounds. And then, I saw it. The creature stood silently among the trees, with its gaunt frame, long arms, and featureless face. It stood as still as a statue, but I could feel the terrifying power emanating from it. It just stood there, watching us, but I knew that if we stopped, it would attack in an instant. "Run!" I screamed, and we all began running for our lives. Our footsteps echoed through the forest, but the creature didn't move. I knew something wasn't right. It had its own plan. Maybe it was waiting for us to tire out, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. We kept running, not daring to stop for even a second. The base came into view ahead, but it was still too far. My heart pounded in my chest, cold sweat dripping down my face. Laura was behind me, her breathing labored, but no one dared to stop. Finally, as we neared the base, the creature stopped following. It vanished into the darkness of the forest, but I knew it wasn't gone. It was just retreating for now, but it wouldn't give up. We stumbled into the base, slamming the door shut and collapsing to the ground, gasping for breath. Janine had fallen, exhausted and terrified, but she was safe, for now. Laura sat beside her, her eyes full of worry and fear. But I knew. This wasn't over. That creature was still out there, and it had followed us out of that cave. The next morning, as the sun began to rise over the mountains, we packed up camp. Laura was airlifted out for medical treatment. Her injuries needed care we couldn't provide in the field. I watched the helicopter disappear into the distance, the memories of the past 24 hours replaying in my mind as I packed up our gear. Once again, I stood before the entrance of the cave. The bushes had been cleared, revealing the bare entrance like an open wound. I stared into the darkness within. A part of me wanted to go back to seek answers, but I understood that some things are better left unexplored. In the end, I turned away and walked toward the truck. There were still many more searches, many more rescues, and countless mysteries waiting, but I learned one thing. Not all mysteries are meant to be solved. As we drove back to headquarters, I glanced at Laura. She was alert, but silent, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon. We never spoke of what we had seen that night, neither to each other, nor to anyone else. It was an unspoken agreement, a burden we each carried alone. Life went on as usual. I continued with my work. Another call came in, requesting assistance in the remote area of the Wenatchee National Forest. A veteran park ranger, Bruce Lanning, had reported something strange, a campsite left behind with signs of a struggle, but no people in sight. We frequently find abandoned campsites in a hurry, but something in Bruce's voice told me this was different. I met Bruce at the ranger station. He was a seasoned veteran, someone I had known and trusted for years. If he said something was wrong, it was worth checking out. Bruce greeted me with a firm handshake. "Glad you're here. I've never seen anything like this. This isn't just a case of a lost hiker. There's something else going on." We drove to the scene in his old Jeep, the forest growing denser as the road narrowed and the trees thickened. Bruce was silent for most of the drive, which wasn't like him. Finally, he spoke. "I found it yesterday. The tent was slashed, equipment scattered everywhere. It looked like they left in a hurry, but no signs of blood, no tracks leaving, and no signs of wildlife." I asked, "Wildlife?" though I already knew the answer. Bruce would have mentioned tracks if there were any. "No sign of bears or cougars," he replied with a grave look. "Something's not right here." The campsite was about an hour's drive into the forest, in a secluded spot near a stream. We parked the Jeep and walked the last half-mile. The forest was eerily quiet, only the sound of our footsteps on the soft ground and the distant babble of the stream. When we arrived, I saw Bruce had been right. The tent was indeed slashed, not torn by an animal, but cleanly cut with a blade. Sleeping bags were thrown far away, backpacks overturned, and the food untouched. It seemed like whoever had been here left in a hurry, or was taken. The air here held a palpable sense of fear, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I crouched beside the tent, examining the cuts. These were made by something very sharp, probably a knife? "That's what I thought," Bruce said. "But why would they cut their own tent? And where did they go?" I stood up, scanning the area. "Let's search for more signs. Maybe we missed something." We spent the next few hours combing through the surrounding forest. It was slow, meticulous work. As the day wore on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I reassured myself it was just the pressure of the situation and the natural anxiety of seeing an abandoned campsite. By late afternoon, we decided to head back to the Jeep. As we neared it, Bruce suddenly stopped and raised his hand to stop me. "Do you hear that?" I listened, straining to catch any sound. At first I heard nothing, just the usual sounds of the forest. Then very faintly I heard it, a low, rhythmic drumming as if coming from far off. It came from deep within the forest, far from the trail. "Drumming?" I frowned. "Out here?" Bruce shook his head. "No one's supposed to be in this area." "Let's check it out," I said, though the uneasy feeling in my stomach was growing. We followed the sound, carefully making our way through the thick brush. The drumming grew louder as we got closer, turning into a clear rhythm that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't like any drumming I'd ever heard. It was primal, almost natural, like the heartbeat of the forest itself. We crested a small hill and found ourselves looking down into a valley, where the trees formed a tight circle around a clearing. In the center of that clearing was something I could only describe as a ritual site. Rough stone altars, primitive and ancient-looking, stood in a crude circle. On them were what appeared to be animal bones, arranged in patterns that made my skin crawl. "What the hell is this?" Bruce whispered. I had no answer. We approached cautiously, all our senses on high alert. The drumming, or whatever it had been, had stopped as soon as we entered the clearing. The silence was oppressive, like a tangible force weighing down on us. As we examined the site, I found something that made my blood run cold. On one of the stone altars was a human skull, partially buried beneath the pile of animal bones. It looked old, worn by time, but there was no mistaking that it was a human skull. "Bruce," I called softly, "come here." He came over, his face growing more serious. "This just keeps getting worse." I nodded, my mind racing. "We need to report this. We need a team out here to investigate." But as we turned to leave, a sound stopped us dead in our tracks. It was a low, guttural growl, seemingly coming from everywhere and nowhere. I looked at Bruce, and I could see the fear in his eyes. This wasn't a bear or a cougar. This was something else, something we couldn't understand. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. Now. We started back toward the Jeep, moving as quickly and quietly as we could. The forest seemed to close in around us, the shadows growing longer as the sun began to set. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. Halfway back, Bruce stumbled and fell, cursing. I helped him up, and that's when we saw it, a tall, gaunt figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was humanoid, but something was off. Its limbs were too long, its movements too smooth, and its face, there was no face, just a blank, featureless surface. We stood frozen, staring at the creature. It tilted its head as if studying us, and then it moved, fast, faster than I could have imagined. It lunged toward us in the blink of an eye. Bruce screamed and fired his gun, but the creature dodged, moving with an inhuman speed and grace. "Run!" I shouted, shoving Bruce toward the Jeep. We bolted, the creature right behind us. I could hear its footsteps, feel its breath on the back of my neck. We burst out of the forest and reached the Jeep. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking as Bruce jumped into the passenger seat. The creature emerged from the trees, just as I started the engine. I slammed my foot on the gas, driving out of the clearing and down the narrow trail. The last I saw of the creature, it was standing at the edge of the forest, watching us with its featureless face. We didn't stop until we reached the ranger station. Bruce was pale, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette. "What the hell just happened, Gunner?" I shook my head. "I don't know, but we need to get a team out there. This is beyond us." We reported the incident, and a team was sent to investigate the campsite and the ritual site. They found the same strange scene we had, but no trace of the creature. The human skull was identified as belonging to a hiker who had gone missing years ago, but there were no clues as to what had happened to him. The official report blamed a tragic accident caused by a disturbed individual, but Bruce and I knew better. We had seen that creature, felt its presence, and we knew it was still out there, deep in the Wenatchee forest. When the call came in, I had just finished a week-long search for a missing hiker in the Cascade Range. For me, it was just another day at work. Over the course of more than a decade as a search and rescue officer for the U.S. Forest Service, I had trudged through the thick forests of Washington state, facing countless challenges. This job often demanded long hours, treacherous terrain, and sometimes the hardest task of all, delivering the heartbreaking news to families that their loved one would not be coming home. But I kept going because someone had to do it. And no matter how difficult it got, I believed in bringing people home. My name is Gunnar Fitzpatrick, and I've seen a lot of strange things during my time on the job, but nothing could compare to what I experienced that day. It started like any other call. The radio crackled, snapping Gunnar out of his thoughts. "Fitzpatrick, got a new mission for you," came the gravelly voice of Ray Carver, his boss, a grizzled man whose eyes had seen far too much unexplained phenomena during his years working in these deep woods. Gunnar reached over and adjusted the volume on the radio. "What's the situation, Ray?" "A camping group's been reported missing down in the southern area near Devil's Cave," Ray said in a tone Gunnar recognized immediately. This wasn't an ordinary call. Devil's Cave. Just the name carried with it a mystique of eerie stories that everyone in the field had heard. Unsolved disappearances, strange creatures seen darting in and out of the shadows, and survivors returning with fear in their eyes, unwilling to recount what they had gone through. Gunnar had never set foot there, and he had never wanted to. Devil's Cave? Gunnar hesitated, a cold feeling spreading in his chest. "You've got to be kidding me." "No joke, Gunnar. This is real. The family's been missing for over 24 hours now. We need to get in there." Ray paused for a moment before continuing, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "And Gunnar, be careful. I don't want to lose anyone else." Turning off the radio, Gunnar sat in silence for a moment. Devil's Cave. The mere mention of the place was enough to send chills down anyone's spine. Why would anyone choose such a mysterious location to camp? No one could explain why the disappearances happened there, but everyone knew the haunting reputation the area carried. Gunnar had heard stories of those who vanished without a trace, leaving behind abandoned campsites, scattered belongings, and signs of struggle that were never solved. Pulling on his jacket and grabbing his flashlight, Gunnar stepped outside into the chilly air. The damp smell of foliage clung to the atmosphere, and the dry twigs snapped beneath his boots as he walked toward the truck parked nearby. This trip wasn't like the others. Something was waiting for them in the darkness of those dense woods, something not of this world. When Gunnar started the truck, the engine's roar shattered the eerie quiet. Waves of unease rippled down his spine as he glanced toward the looming dark mountain range where Devil's Cave awaited. The disappearances, the rumors of strange creatures, it all felt more real than ever. He exhaled deeply, pressed the gas pedal, and sped down the narrow road leading into the ominous forest. In Gunnar's mind, thoughts swirled about what he might have to face. He remembered the stories told by those who had survived, how their eyes looked dazed, lost, and how they always refused to recount what they had seen. Could there really be something lurking there, something humans were never meant to encounter? Gunnar's truck rumbled over the gravelly path, cutting through the dense darkness of the forest. The faint beam of his headlights barely pierced the sea of trees before him. The air grew colder as he ventured deeper into the woods, and the rustling of dry branches overhead sounded like distant whispers, echoing from some mysterious place. Finally, Gunnar stopped the truck at the side of the road, knowing that he could go no further by vehicle. The rest of the journey would have to be on foot. Glancing around, Gunnar couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something, or someone, was watching him from the dense shadows where his flashlight couldn't reach. He checked his flashlight, gun, and radio before setting off toward the coordinates Ray had provided. His footsteps echoed in the oppressive silence, each step seeming to stir something invisible in the quiet forest. This place felt different from the other two, silent, but not peaceful. It was a suffocating silence, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. As he made his way through the broken branches and thick underbrush, Gunnar finally caught sight of the campsite ahead. But the first thing that struck him wasn't the sight of tents. It was the chaos that blanketed the area. Belongings were scattered everywhere, tents slashed open, and not a single sign of life. Raising his flashlight, Gunnar swept the beam across the torn canvas of the tents. It didn't look like the work of a bear or any wild animal. The cuts were too clean, as if made by a sharp blade. Footprints crisscrossed the ground, but they weren't human. Something else had been here, something far more dangerous and strange. He stepped carefully into the campsite, each footfall measured and tense. There was no sound except for the wind rustling through the trees. His flashlight scanned every corner of the camp until it caught on a dark stain on the ground. Blood. A long smear, but not much. Just enough to confirm that someone had been injured, but no bodies remained. A sudden noise broke the silence behind him. Gunnar whirled around, his heart pounding in his chest. His flashlight quickly swept the area, but there was nothing but the bare trunks of trees. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was nearby, watching him. Then, from deep within the forest, a strange sound echoed. It wasn't like anything Gunnar had ever heard before. It wasn't the sound of an animal, nor was it the wind. It was a low murmur, like a whisper carried from some distant, unknowable place. The sound sent a chill down his spine. It was as if the forest itself was breathing, but with a dark, sinister intent. Gunnar raised his radio. "Ray, I'm at the campsite. It's completely destroyed. There's blood, but no bodies. No sign of anyone," he said, keeping his voice low, as if not to disturb whatever might be lurking in the shadows. "Copy that, Gunnar. Be careful. Check the surrounding area." Ray's voice crackled through the radio, tinged with concern. Gunnar took a few more steps toward the main tent. Inside, the belongings were in disarray, and a sleeping bag had been torn to shreds. He crouched down, examining it more closely, but as his flashlight swept across a dark corner, he felt the air grow noticeably colder. A heavy, oppressive feeling descended upon him, like an unseen presence weighing him down. Then he heard it, a raspy breathing, very close, as if someone were standing right behind him. Goosebumps prickled across his skin and his heart raced. Gunnar turned swiftly, his flashlight slicing through the darkness, but there was nothing. Yet the sensation of being watched did not fade. Deciding it was time to retreat, Gunnar knew the signs all pointed to this place being unsafe. But just as he turned to leave, another sound echoed from deep within the forest. This time, it was clearer, a chilling, guttural roar reverberating through the silent woods. Gunnar froze. That sound didn't belong to any creature he had ever known. And then, a fleeting movement at the edge of his vision, a large, shadowy figure moving swiftly between the trees. Gunnar tried to keep calm, but the fear was creeping deeper into his bones. Whatever it was, something that didn't belong to this world, was hunting in the darkness. The creature began to move closer, each heavy step shaking the ground. Gunnar knew he couldn't stay still any longer. He jerked his flashlight up, shining it directly into the creature's face, hoping it might retreat. But the weak light did nothing except highlight the horrifying details of the beast's form. Its red eyes remained locked on Gunnar, unmoved by the beam. "No!" Gunnar yelled, his voice shaking but determined. He turned and sprinted toward his truck. His legs moved as fast as they could, but every step felt as if he was being pulled back by an invisible force. Behind him, Gunnar could hear the creature's footsteps, crushing the forest floor beneath its immense weight. It was closing in. Gunnar fought the urge to look back, but he couldn't resist. When he did, the creature was closer than ever. Its glowing red eyes were only a few meters away, its massive shadow looming over him, engulfing him in darkness. In that moment, Gunnar could feel the creature's malevolent presence, like a cold wave enveloping his senses. In a final desperate act, Gunnar flung his flashlight toward the creature, hoping to slow it down. But the flashlight hit the ground and went out instantly, plunging everything into complete darkness. His heart pounded in his chest, cold sweat dripping down his face. He could feel the creature approaching, its hot breath on the back of his neck. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to run, and he sprinted toward the truck, the only sanctuary he could think of. As Gunnar's hand grasped the truck door, a massive, hairy hand reached out from the shadows, nearly grabbing him. By some miracle, he managed to open the door, throwing himself inside and locking it just as the creature slammed into the vehicle, shaking it violently. Its claws scratched against the metal, leaving deep gouges and producing an ear-piercing screech. In sheer panic, Gunnar started the engine, his foot slamming the gas pedal. The truck roared to life, speeding away from the creature. In his rearview mirror, he saw its hulking figure fade into the darkness, standing there, watching him with those glowing, hateful eyes. Gunnar didn't stop until his truck was safely on the narrow road leading out of the forest. The creature's roar still echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder that it was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. Gunnar sat slumped on the ground, his entire body aching, his breath ragged as though he had narrowly escaped death's grasp. The beams from the rescue team's headlights surrounded him, but in his mind, the darkness still weighed heavily. The roars of the creature echoed endlessly in his head, its fiery red eyes etched into his memory, impossible to erase. Though the panic in his chest had momentarily subsided, the fear clung to him, relentless and unyielding. A rescue worker crouched beside Gunnar, concern etched across his face. "Are you all right?" the man asked, his voice soft but urgent. Gunnar nodded weakly, but deep down, he knew he was far from all right. "That creature... it's still here," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the pitch-black forest behind them. The rescue workers exchanged uneasy glances, saying nothing. They had heard the stories about this forest, but none of them had ever imagined they would come face to face with something beyond comprehension. "We need to get out of here," Gunnar gasped, his hands trembling as he struggled to stand. "That thing can't be stopped by light. It will come back." The rescue team quickly helped Gunnar to his feet and guided him toward the rescue vehicle. But just as they prepared to leave, a cold wind swept through the forest, carrying with it a strange sound, a murmuring like the whispers of 1,000 voices. Gunnar froze mid-step, his eyes widening. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as though the forest itself had come to life. One of the rescue workers switched on a flashlight, the beam cutting through the trees. Gunnar's heart pounded as he recognized the whispers, but this time they were different. It wasn't just the threat of the strange creature. It was something deeper, an ancient secret buried in the heart of the forest. "Let's go," Gunnar urged. "We can't stay here another minute." But as they made to leave, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble, gently at first, then growing stronger. The trees quivered, their dry branches clashing together with a bone-chilling screech. Gunnar looked around in panic as something began to rise from the earth. Stones emerged from the ground, one by one, as if pulled up by some unseen force. The ground split open, a small but deep fissure, like a wound tearing itself wide. From deep within the earth, a thick black smoke poured out, swirling like ghostly fingers reaching up to claim them. Gunnar stepped back, but the cold wind and the whispers clung to him, as if the forest had awakened and wasn't about to let them go. "Get out of here," Gunnar shouted. But before he could move, a shape appeared in the heart of the fissure. The creature. It wasn't just a fleeting shadow between the trees anymore, but a solid entity, more massive than ever. The black smoke coiled around it like a cloak, and its glowing red eyes gleamed in the darkness, locked onto the rescue team like a predator stalking its prey. "Run!" Gunnar screamed, but his legs wouldn't move. The creature's presence was overpowering, like an invisible force pinning him in place. The icy fingers of fear gripped his mind, dragging him into the depths of despair. The creature began to advance, its massive steps shaking the ground beneath it. It roared, a sound that wasn't just noise but a vibrating pulse that rippled through the air, causing the trees around them to tremble. Gunnar could feel the overwhelming terror seeping into everyone around him. The rescue workers scattered in panic. Some fell, others ran wildly. But the creature didn't pursue them. Its eyes remained fixed on Gunnar, as if he were its sole target. Gunnar felt hypnotized by its gaze, unable to look away, unable to move. It was the feeling of a man about to be destroyed. But just as the creature was about to reach him, a loud explosion rang out, piercing the silence. Gunnar jerked, turning to see one of the rescue workers had fired his rifle, the shot hitting the creature directly. The creature howled in pain, retreating a few steps, its red eyes flaring with fury. Black smoke rose from the wound, swirling around its body as if trying to heal itself. But the most terrifying part was, it didn't fall. Gunnar knew immediately. Bullets wouldn't kill this thing. Yet the creature didn't give them time to escape. It roared again, and the entire forest shook violently. From the ground, tendrils of black smoke reached out like hands, grasping the legs of the rescue workers, pulling them down. Screams echoed through the air as several were dragged into the earth, disappearing into bottomless pits. Gunnar had no choice but to run, but the darkness was closing in fast. He knew he couldn't escape this nightmare unless he found a way to face it. Just when Gunnar was about to be consumed by despair, a sudden flash of light appeared ahead. It wasn't the headlights of the rescue vehicles, but a pure white light shining from deep within the forest. The strange creature halted, roaring in rage, but this time it stepped back. The light grew stronger and stronger, pushing back the darkness and the black smoke. Gunnar blinked, unable to believe what he was seeing. He felt a sense of relief, but he still wasn't sure if he was truly safe. And then from within that light, another figure appeared. Not the dark creature, but something else, a being entirely opposed to the darkness. That figure moved closer to Gunnar, and as the light enveloped him, he felt a safety unlike anything he had ever known. The dark creature roared one last time before disappearing into the shadows, dissolving like mist as the light spread throughout the forest. Gunnar collapsed, his entire body trembling, but he knew he had survived, at least for now. The white light gradually faded, leaving behind a forest as quiet as if nothing had happened. Gunnar lay flat on the ground, breathing heavily, cold sweat streaming down his forehead. He looked around, his vision blurred from exhaustion. The remaining rescue workers lay scattered on the ground, trying to regain their composure after the horrifying encounter with the dark creature. The silence around them was eerie. No wind, no birds. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. Slowly, Gunnar sat up, feeling his body ache as if it had been crushed under the weight of fear. He couldn't believe he had survived this nightmare. But the terror hadn't disappeared. The creature was gone, but he knew it hadn't truly been destroyed. It was still out there, lurking in the shadows of the forest, waiting for the right moment to return. He turned to look at the rescue team. Some were helping their comrades stand, but everyone's faces were pale, filled with horror. Their terrified eyes darted around, as if expecting the creature to suddenly reappear. But the worst part was that a few of the rescue workers were no longer there. They had been dragged into the ground by the dark hands, completely disappearing into the bottomless abyss. None of them could return. "We need to leave now," Gunnar said, his voice hoarse but firm. "That creature hasn't really vanished. If we stay any longer, more people will die." One of the rescue workers, a man with dazed eyes from fear, nodded. "But we can't leave those who are missing behind. They..." His voice choked, unable to continue. Gunnar looked toward the crack that the creature had opened. The dark hands were gone and the ground seemed to have closed up, but he knew that those who had been pulled down had no chance of survival. "They're gone," Gunnar said, his voice colder than ever. "And if we don't leave now, we'll become like them." The entire rescue team fell silent. The harsh truth of the situation weighed heavily on them. No one wanted to admit it, but they all understood that they had narrowly escaped death. Gunnar led the group out of the forest, every step heavy with vigilance. Even though the light had pushed back the darkness, the forest still held a sinister gloom, as if it were watching their every move. Everyone moved in silence, no one daring to speak, only the sound of footsteps on dry leaves and the ragged breathing of the survivors. Finally, after hours of grueling walking, they reached the edge of the forest. The sky was gradually brightening, but none of them felt relieved. The sunlight filtering through the trees seemed unable to dispel the cold feeling the forest had left in their hearts. Gunnar stood still at the forest's edge, his eyes still fixed on the thick darkness behind. "That creature? It doesn't belong to this world," Gunnar said, his voice low, not just to warn his team but also to remind himself. "This forest is cursed. It existed long before we came here, and it will continue to exist, hiding secrets that no one should ever uncover." Ray, Gunnar's boss, appeared from a distance, his face full of concern as he saw the devastation before him. "You saved everyone, Gunnar? But what the hell happened in there?" Ray asked, his eyes filled with confusion. Gunnar remained silent for a moment, as if struggling to find the words to describe what he had witnessed. "I don't know where to start," he said softly. "But the one thing I'm sure of is, we should never go back there. Never." Ray frowned, wanting to ask more, but seeing the exhausted and grave look on Gunnar's face, he realized that no answer would ever be enough to explain what had happened in the forest. The next day, the area around Devil's Cave was completely sealed off. The government cited safety concerns as the reason for banning public access to the campsite, but all the survivors knew it was just an excuse to cover up the truth. What they had witnessed could never be made public. The world wasn't ready to accept that there were things beyond human understanding. Gunnar never returned to that forest again. He quit his job in search and rescue, left Washington, and tried to build a new life. But sleepless nights and nightmares of glowing red eyes and thick darkness continued to haunt him. Even though he had left the forest, the fear of that creature still clung to him, like a curse that could never be lifted. Before leaving, Gunnar left behind a warning. There are secrets in this world that should never be uncovered. This forest is one of them. Never go back. And although the forest was sealed off, rumors about it continued to spread. Stories of strange creatures and dark shadows never disappeared, only buried deeper, waiting for the right moment to return. Gunnar knew that even though he had escaped, the darkness was still lurking, and one day it would come back, bringing a nightmare no one could escape. And as night fell, the terrifying roar from the forest could still be heard, like a warning to all who dared to set foot in the place where darkness reigns forever.